Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to the Grit City Think and Drink. I'm Jim Gal, your host. Can you guys hear okay? It feels like it's a little low. Um, some folks new to the Grit City Think and Drink tonight. Anybody? Excellent. Well, welcome. So we do this the second Tuesday every month, except during the summer when it gets swelteringly hot back here. So we don't do it at that time. But our next speaker is coming April 8th. Ilya Ravichandran. I should have actually asked her how to say the name. But she's going to be talking, she does law, and she's going to be talking about sort of how we actually use people that are sort of seed makers or seed, we should call them seed portals, basically, people to make sense of what it's like to do things and get things positively done at this time of year. So she's going to talk in April. We have already have our speakers set up for May and June, so we hope you'll come back and join us. If you want to get on the listserv, I swear I don't actually ask ever for money because I do this for free. But you can actually scan the QR code and send in your email address, and I basically put you on the listserv so you get notices about what's coming up. So feel free to add yourself on there. If you missed any talks, except unfortunately the last one, oh, we did. Okay. Excellent. Cool. So most of the talks when the AV boy here doesn't screw up are actually recorded. And so you can actually go to the Grit City Think and Drink. If you just Google Tacoma Grit City Think and Drink, you can go back and check out some of the old talks that you may have missed and see some of the stuff, the cool content. So hopefully you'll check that out. If you haven't been here before, what we do is I'll introduce the speaker. He'll give you a talk to knock your socks off. And then we'll come up, give him a short break. We'll give away some prizes. So if you haven't yet, I'll get you a raffle ticket. We'll give away some swag, which is hats right now with the Grit City logo on it. So you can show off to all your friends how you thunk and drunk at the same time. And then we will come back up and we'll do a Q&A with the speaker so you can ask questions afterwards. Sound good? All right. So without further ado, our speaker tonight, Daniel Lewis. Dr. Daniel Lewis. Woohoo! Is a professor and viewer of movies. I feel like I fall into that category too. And shows about professors. His research interests include masculinity studies, including gender performance in films, television, and social media. And otherwise, he's actually, I think, in witness protection because you can't find anything out about him online. So I'll let him tell a little bit more about himself. Without further ado, it's all yours, Daniel.
All right. Thank you all for coming out. Can you hear me okay? I know it's a little loud. Yeah, sorry about that. So before I get started, and I will go back to this here. Let me just move ahead. To tell you a little bit about myself, the topic that I'm going to be presenting does come sort of from an autobiographical place, which is that I am a professor. I am a professor who teaches classes on writing, composition, literature. And I started to think, where did my ideas about what professors do, where do those ideas come from? Where did the ideas in my head come from about how professors should behave, how they should look, how they should speak, what they should teach? Where did those ideas come from? I grew up in a family of very intelligent people, but people who did not go to college. And as I was growing up, I did not know any professors. I actually didn't know any educators, period. But specifically, I did not know any professors personally, nobody in my family. And all of my ideas when I was younger about how professors look, how they speak, how they teach, how they behave, all came from movies and television because that was my only access to the world of professors. And I started to wonder about that. And I started to think about like, well, what ideas did I have in my head when I was a little kid? And I'm going to be talking about one movie that I saw as a little kid that put ideas into my head, unfortunately. And I started to think about, well, in general, what kind of representation do professors have in television and film? I'm only going to be talking about film. There are many examples I could give of the representation of professors in television. I'm going to be talking about one exception near the end, but mostly I'm going to be talking about film. And so I started to think about this and think about what kinds of representations do you see? And then more than that, I started to think about, well, where did those representations come from? Not what preceded those representations? Where were those ideas coming from? This is a presentation that is based on self-reflexivity, the idea of critically examining your own beliefs, your own ideas. I'm not going to talk tremendously a lot about of my own life, but I will. The first movie I will talk about was a movie that I had seen multiple times as a kid, and put ideas into my head about how professors should behave. More importantly, I want to talk about where do student expectations come from in terms of their ideas about how professors should behave, how professors should speak, what should professors should teach in the classroom, what is their classroom persona. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about Jean Baudrillard. This quote, "It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real," comes from Jean Baudrillard's probably most well-known work, which I'll be discussing more in just a second here. But the reason why I'm starting here is because it gives a sort of grounding for this presentation. In that, what I will argue is that often these representations become so popular, become so widespread, so well known, that they begin to influence the way professors actually behave, and more importantly, what students expect from professors. So this argument, this theory of Jean Baudrillard's, has to do with what he argued was the precession of simulacra. What does the precession of simulacra mean? It is a phrase he coined that refers to the idea that in contemporary society, simulations and copies of reality, which he called simulacra, become so prevalent that they precede and determine our perception of reality itself, effectively blurring the lines between what is real and what is simulated. Essentially, the image becomes more real than the thing it represents. In this reality, the image, the representation of the real, becomes more well-known, more widespread than the real. It is more accepted than the real, and then becomes the real. He argued that we've moved beyond simple ideas of imitation, where a copy is clearly distinguishable from the original. And in the age of simulation, the copy becomes the primary reality. The real becomes secondary or even irrelevant. The first example I'm going to give about this has to do with this film, Back to School. And when I'm talking about this film, this is the one that as a kid I had seen multiple times. It was on HBO, and I was allowed, for whatever reason as a kid, to watch this film many times. And it is a we use the term problematic. It is a problematic film in many ways that I will get to, but specifically, it is a problematic film in how it represents professors, female professors in this case specifically, and how they are perceived in the classroom and treated by students in the classroom. Back to School was released in 1986. It was directed by Alan Metter. It stars Rodney Dangerfield and Sally Kellerman as the main professor. The film follows Rodney Dangerfield's character. His name is Thornton Mellon. He decides to join his son at college. His son is thinking about dropping out of college. And Rodney Dangerfield's character decides to join his son in college to convince him not to drop out. It is a very silly, flimsy premise and a very silly, flimsy movie. It follows a very predictable plot. He is a wealthy businessman, and through the course of the film, he sort of buys his way through his classes and pays people to do his assignments. There's a lengthy subplot where he hires Kurt Vonnegut, the author, to write a paper about Kurt Vonnegut for his class. Kurt Vonnegut shows up in one scene, which is the best scene in the movie. And then by the end of the movie, he has convinced his son to, spoiler, to not drop out of college. Um, and he himself graduates somehow. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Um, a few of his professors play really important roles in the film, specifically his English professor, played by Sally Kellerman. Her performance as Dr. Diane Turner is intensely physical and sexual in its way. I want to show you a clip, which is the first time that Rodney Dangerfield meets his English professor in the classroom. He sees her, as you will see. But as you watch this clip, keep in mind that throughout the entire film, her character is defined by her physicality, defined by her earthiness, defined by her sexual persona. We won't watch this whole clip. It's, but you can get a sense of it from this. But okay, so throughout the film, what you see is that Dangerfield continually projects this fantasy onto her. His fantasy makes the film's point of view clear as it illustrates Laura Mulvey's well-known concept of the male gaze. Mulvey writes that the determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, and that the women in the film are simultaneously looked at and displayed with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness. In the brief moment where before her character is sexualized and made the focus of Dangerfield's fantasy, the film seems to present Kellerman as the source of authority and power in the classroom. Interplay between professors and students, especially male students, is a constant concern by female and non-binary professors. Quote, women faculty reported 55% more negative consequences as a result of their most serious experience of academic contra-power harassment than men faculty. In fact, gender was the only significant predicator of more negative outcomes in a regression model included other faculty markers of socio-cultural power, like race or age or rank. Women faculty also reported more extensive accounts of harassment and somewhat more intimidation, threats, and bullying from students than men faculty, and incidents containing harassment were associated with more negative consequences. To make this use of the male gaze even clearer, this scene is preceded by two very different depictions of college professors, both male and white. Comedian Sam Kinison plays an intense, loud history professor who frightens most of the students in his class with an angry lecture. At one point, he tears off the back of a chair and throws it across the room. While his performance is passionate, it is certainly not erotic or sexualized in the way that Kellerman's teaching style was depicted. It is emotional, but the emotions are limited to anger and aggression rather than emotions that are conventionally deemed feminine. In fact, Sam Kinison's overall demeanor in the class is far angrier than any other professors that we see in the film. In comparison, actor Paxton Whitehead plays Philip Barbey, a professor of economics, who is a dry and somewhat boring know-it-all whose academic knowledge of the subject matter is immediately challenged by Dangerfield's real-world experience. Kinison's character is a Vietnam veteran whose knowledge of history is colored by his own experiences in war, but this performance does not really tap into any pre-existing stereotypes of history professors or educators. In general, rather, it is merely a vehicle for Kinison's onstage comedy persona. The joke seems to be that it would be funny if this loud, wild, obscene comedian was an educator at a well-regarded university. Whitehead's performance as an economics professor is more directly tied to a stereotype of college professors being dry, boring, and pretentious. In most representations of male professors, there are two basic types. One is the dry, boring professor who bores his students, puts them to sleep. The other is the out of control, sometimes drunk, sometimes high professor who's a sort of unpredictable wild card in the classroom. Barbey's lecture is largely monotone, devoid of anger or intensity. It is not sexualized in any way. His professor persona in the film is akin to the representation of educators that one would see in even earlier films and television shows that depicted them as asexual, unexciting, and out of touch from the real world as they isolate themselves within the ivory tower. While the style of Kinison and Whitehead's professor performance differs greatly, Both maintain authority in their respective classrooms, despite some initial resistance from Dangerfield's character. The same cannot be said for Kellerman, who is the only female professor represented in the film. That lack of any meaningful authority or power becomes the most egregious aspect of this representation of female professors. Though it presents Kellerman's professor as a figure with sexual power, the film never shows that she has any real authority over Mellon, even when he submits a plagiarized essay in her class. However, if the film allows her any power other than sexual, it is in the ability to tap into the correct, that's in quotes, interpretation of literature. As Timothy Cairns argues, Kellerman presents the, quote, popular conception of what is right and what is wrong with English professors, as she represents a field of study that advertises endless interpretations of literature, even though she apparently believes in only one correct interpretation. Though her body is often dressed in formal professor-type clothing, her voice and demeanor undermine that authority, as they are used to convey only eroticism and sexuality. From her first appearance in the film until her last, she remains nothing more than Dangerfield's school teacher fantasy, who is devoted almost exclusively to helping him find that correct interpretation of the text and eventually bedding him in the process. Kellerman's performance taps into even more problematic stereotypes. The filmmakers use her character to fully equate literature with femininity, specifically linking literature only with female eroticism. Literature, femininity, and emotions become intrinsically linked in the film. Repeatedly, Kellerman's lectures or lessons are all about how literature makes you feel. There is no discussion that deviates from what emotions a text makes you feel or what mood a text creates for the reader. In Back to School, feelings like art are positioned firmly in the feminine realm. Femininity, according to this film, is sex and eroticism and physicality. Nearly every scene with Kellerman is intended to be sensual or erotic in some way, and that becomes her character's most defining characteristic, maybe her only characteristic. In addition, nearly every female character in the film is defined by their sexuality. Numerous female college students are depicted as objects for lust for Mellon and his equally older friend, played by Burt Young. At the beginning of the film, Mellon walks in on his wife cheating on him with another man. There are numerous jokes about her having sex with multiple people. And even the least sexualized female character, the love interest of Mellon's son, enters her first scene in the movie as her body is being discussed by his son and his friend. In Kellerman's second appearance in the classroom, she begins class by saying they will be discussing The Great Gatsby. She immediately calls on Dangerfield and asks, "Mr. Mellon, how would you characterize The Great Gatsby?" She means the character, not the book itself. He jokes and says, "He's great." Everyone laughs except for Kellerman, who is visibly disappointed. She tells him, "See me after class." We can imagine a film with a male professor who lectures the student for not completing the assigned reading or encourages the student to do better in their class. However, because Kellerman is female, the film sexualizes every aspect of her character, even here. After class, Dangerfield asks her to be his tutor. She agrees by inviting him over to her house later that night. At her house, she asks Dangerfield to read The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats out loud. She then asks him, "What does that make you think of?" He jokes about his ex-wife's appearance. Kellerman then tries to convince him of the joys of reading so that he can, quote, share and understand the common feelings of all mankind, the feelings of being alive. He jokes that he once went out with an English teacher. "I sent her a love letter. She corrected it." Again, female English teachers are sexualized object first and foremost. The tutoring sessions quickly turn into a romantic date as they decide to go out for dinner. Then they return to her house and have sex. At no point in the film is the issue of a professor dating and having sex with a student who is enrolled in their class mentioned. I'm going to move ahead to the next example, but as in the end of the movie, for various stupid reasons, Dangerfield has to have a oral exam with all of his professors all at the same time in one big classroom. It doesn't make any sense. All she does for the final exam is she asks him to recite Dylan Thomas poem and then asks him how does it make him feel. He answers, he passes, he graduates. The end. I want to move on to my next example, which is the Barbra Streisand film The Mirror Has Two Faces. Produced in 1996, it was directed by Barbra Streisand and stars Barbra Streisand and Jeff Bridges. This is new. This is almost a decade, a little bit more than a decade after Back to School. This film is she plays the English professor. He plays a mathematics professor in this film. Jeff Bridges does. It's reminiscent of classic Hollywood romantic comedies. The score sounds like it should be from a 1940s sort of slapstick rom-com. But it also has a profound 1990s sensibility, namely that the protagonist, Barbara Streisand, is a female professor who feels pressure to change her appearance and become more feminine, yet refuses to do so by film's end. Similarly, the love interest, Jeff Bridges, a mathematics professor, is not the typical male leading man. He is attempting to become completely disengaged from sex. He gets angry when the subject comes up. He even goes as far as to seek a relationship with a woman that is not physical in any way. As the movie tries to communicate to the audience what Barbara Streisand does for a living, her sister places an ad, a dating ad, and how the movie communicates to the audience that she is a professor of literature is the dating ad has a photo of Barbara Streisand, and on the back in giant letters it says professor of literature, and that's how they communicate that to the audience. Which is, yeah, okay. The audience is presented with only two scenes of any significant length, focusing on Streisand in the classroom. In the first and the longer of the two, Streisand gives a passionate lecture about love and romance and sex. She barely refers to any specific texts or authors, and it is often unclear what the students are reading or studying. I'm hesitant to show us this clip, so I don't know if it'll work. Yeah, no, Doug. So in this clip that you're going to see, this is one of two scenes in the film where they really show Barbara Streisand in the classroom. And oh, there we go. Okay, so you get the idea there. In contrast to Streisand's classroom presence, Jeff Bridges' classroom presence is very dry, very monotone. The first scene you see with him in the classroom, his students are bored, they're falling asleep. He's kind of not even aware of them. He's talking over them and not really paying attention to them. In Streisand's classroom performance, her persona is very personal. She talks about, as you saw in that clip, she talks about her sister, she talks about her love life, her appearance. She refers to students by their names. She moves freely around the classroom. In Jeff Bridges' classroom performance, he sort of stays back by the board. He doesn't move around. She speaks in a really energetic and passionate way. While this depiction is not sexualized as Kellerman's is in Back to School, her presence in the classroom is physical. It is animated. It is emotional. It is always in motion. And again, we have the study of literature connected to emotions, to love, to feelings, and specifically, as you saw in that clip, to love and sex. Female professors are represented as the embodiment of this. Streisand's character is almost fully defined by romance and love and physical appearance. Bridges' character is all intellect and almost no sexuality. While there is some element of physicality to his character as his body is focused on in scenes of him working out at the gym or paying attention to his appearance, his academic work is almost entirely defined by his brain. It is all logic and rationality in comparison to Streisand's lectures on emotions and feelings. Furthermore, Streisand's job is incidental to the plot of the movie. It exists for that one long lecture scene that you see there, and for her to explain theories about love and romance and sex. But beyond that, Rose is a character who is in an unsatisfying relationship. Bridges, on the other hand, is giving multiple scenes in the classroom. We see how his lecture style changes due to Rose's advice about sharing his personal life with his students. I'm not going to play this clip, but that's what that clip is, where Streisand's character basically tells him, you need to open up to your students, you need to talk about your personal life, you need to sort of share with them. You then see a clip of him doing that, and the students are instantly sort of into what he's saying and laughing and all this other stuff. The movie contains scenes focusing on Jeff Bridges' most recent book, his book tour, how Rose's interest in baseball helps him understand how to better explain certain mathematical concepts to his students. His job is not the focus of the plot, but it is given much more screen time in the film, in a way that is completely absent from Streisand's character. She shows an interest in his area of study and teaching. He shows no interest in literature or her teaching. In addition, he worries about publishing, while Rose seems not to write or be interested in writing or publishing her own work. So, though she is similarly defined by her body and her sexuality, her character is more complex than Kellerman's. One way that Streisand's physical and emotional professor differs from Kellerman's performance in Back to School is that Streisand does not seek her students' attraction and desire as Kellerman does. There's no relationship with a student like in Back to School. She jokes about her body. She doesn't sexualize it in the same way as Kellerman's performance does. And when she does talk about her body in one famous scene, she talks about her chest. Her students laugh instead of ogling or hitting on her. I wanted to point out one article I had read in which this article is written by Dale Bauer. It's an article about teachers in the movies. It's not specifically focused on what I'm doing, but this one part stood out where he praises the performance of Streisand in this movie and suggests that even though she sexualizes the classroom, this ultimately isn't that important because, according to Bauer, all vocations are ultimately sexualized. That is not true in many of the examples I will be giving. It is true only in the examples in which the female professor is focused on. Case in point, The Gambler. So, The Gambler, there are two versions of this film. One is from 1974, one is from a remake in 2014. They're both very similar in terms of their characterization and the plot. There are some differences in the setting, and the 2014 movie was updated somewhat. The 1970 version of The Gambler depicts a literature professor played by James Caan. That's in the one on the left, obviously. In this film, Caan plays Axel Fried, a hard-living gambling addict who also on occasion teaches classes at NYU. Caan's performance leans heavily on a tough guy persona, far removed from any other depiction of English professors that we have seen in film so far. The film was remade in 2014, directed by Rupert Wyatt. In the remake, the English professor character is played by Mark Wahlberg, and he teaches at a fictional university in Los Angeles. In terms of characterization, the films are mostly the same. Perhaps the appeal of this performance is in the juxtaposition of a man who teaches literature during the day, but gambles, fights, and lies, and drinks and steals at night. Outside of the classroom in either version of the film, the characters rarely speak about their job, about literature, about writers, about writing, about publication, or about anything having to do with their area of study. In this way, their jobs are mostly an afterthought, similar to Streisand's character in The Mirror Has Two Faces. We wonder why the characters chose that profession in the first place. In the first film, there's an element of him using a student who's on the basketball team to throw a game because he bet on the team. That's not really present in the remake. So maybe there's a reason why he entered into the teaching profession. Both characters have far more in common with Hemingway's reputation for drinking and hard living than most depictions of professors. The films also have very little to do with literature or teaching or college or students. Both films are loosely based on Dostoevsky's 1866 short novel, The Gambler. In that short novel, the main character works as a tutor, and maybe that's why in both films they're professors. Otherwise, it's unclear. But for my purposes, this is perhaps a fantasy of professors, specifically male professors, one that can balance the femininity and nerdiness of literature with a desire for conventional masculinity. The film's author, the first version of the film, James Toback, was a Harvard-educated writer who temporarily worked as an instructor for the English department at the City College of New York. He did a fair amount of sports writing. He collaborated on a book with famed NFL player Jim Brown. Compared to Kellerman's sexualized but gentle classroom persona in Back to School, Caan and Wahlberg debate their students directly and aggressively. Their teaching persona is more similar to Sam Kinison in Back to School, who's yelling and getting up in students' faces and being very aggressive. It's very similar to that. Like Kellerman, they stand before the class and read to them. Both films feature scenes where the teacher stands there with an open book and reads to the students, much like Kellerman did. But different than Back to School, different than Kellerman's performance, both Kahn and Wahlberg speak in an incredibly authoritative, loud, and aggressive manner. They throw out ideas, they throw out interpretations of what they've read, they counter them, and there's a sparring aspect to the classroom. Their teaching style is very conversational and somewhat informal, but most importantly, their authority is always clear. Neither of them are sexualized in the classroom in any way. They both focus on ideas and philosophy contained in literature, not feelings or emotions. It is the conventionally masculine English classroom. Similar in one way to Back to School, but in both of these films, what they teach, the content of their lectures, are incredibly canonical dead white men. In the first film, they talk about Emerson quite a bit. In the second film, Shakespeare is what Wahlberg likes to talk about, even though in neither movie are their classes defined. Like, what class is this? It's a literature class. I'm not going to show you this clip because I'm going to run out of time, but in this clip of the remake of The Gambler, Mark Wahlberg is very confrontational with that student played by Brie Larson. He gets very close to her face in the middle of class. He asks her if she thinks she's a genius. She sort of demurs. He tells her, "You're not a genius." He then walks away and tells her that she needs to sit in the front row of his class from there on out. Yeah, very aggressive in a way that none of the representations of professors before that have done. Very aggressive, very confrontational, not sexual in any direct way, not erotic in any direct way, but very physical and very confrontational. Before I move on to my last example, I want to give you one more example of how sort of masculine coded both films are. In the first version of the film, the James Caan version, there's a scene where he reads an E. E. Cummings poem out loud. Buffalo Bill's Defunct. He reads it out loud. A female student asks, "What does that mean?" He reads the poem, and the female student asks, "What does that mean?" He looks at her and he says, "It means what it says." End of scene. No discussion of feeling, no discussion of emotion. This is masculine literature. Both films, again, do very similar representations of that kind of performance. The last example I want to talk about is The Chair from 2021. Written by Amanda Peet and Annie Julia Wyman. This was a Netflix series. It only ran for one season. It was canceled after that one season. And in this show, as the photo that I chose for it will show, it's a much more diverse representation of faculty in an English department. The show, if you've never seen it, begins with Sandra Oh as being appointed chair of the English department at a East Coast, I believe it's East Coast, liberal arts school. It focuses on more realistic depictions of how departments operate. You know, they discuss enrollment numbers, they discuss funding, they discuss budgets. They joke about her being their first lady chair. There is a focus in the show on the older faculty versus the younger faculty. You have a number of characters. One is there on the right, but not featured are two other male faculty members who are very old, very, nearing retirement. One of the plot threads in the show is that they are being pushed to retire. In the show, the older faculty, specifically the older male faculty, are shown as being sort of dispassionate, out of touch, very similar to the go back to him. The economics professor in Back to School, sort of out, sort of unemotional, dispassionate, sort of lecturing to a bored classroom. In the first episode of The Chair, one of the older professors only has, I think, 2 or 3 students in their class, while at the same time, a younger faculty, the person in the middle there, her class she has a giant lecture hall. It's filled with people. And the decision is made to combine the classes so that the older faculty can basically learn new methods of teaching, new methods of reaching students because they're sort of presented as being out of touch there. The show overall, and I can talk about this more later, maybe if anybody wants to talk about it, but the show overall sort of veers off and gets focused on a white male faculty member in his early 40s, I believe, who is sort of that kind of representation of professors who sort of he gets drunk and sleeps through a class. He forgets that he's supposed to teach. He sort of messes up in the classroom. He does things that get him in trouble, and students love him until they don't. And he sort of does that sort of representation of the male English professor who is sort of wild, but not too wild. The show ends up focusing a bit too much on that character. I didn't talk about this example, but in the top middle picture there, that's Michael Douglas in the film Wonder Boys. That's another example of a male professor who's drinking, doing drugs, in that movie, hanging out with students in an inappropriate way. And often those are creative writing professors. Make up your mind about that. But to end this part, I want to sort of get to why this matters. And I'm going to go back to Jean Baudrillard and talk about what happens when the real is replaced by the signs of the real. I think representation in this way matters in terms of how it creates expectations in students for how professors should do their job. I think they're often, these representations are rooted in harmful stereotypes and discriminatory ideas found in these movies. Something like The Chair is working against that in terms of showing more diverse faculty, showing more accurate representations of how professors do their jobs and what they do, even though it gets sidetracked by focusing a little bit too much on one character. But it sort of is working against that idea. And when you see these representations of female professors or non-binary professors or professors of color, they often are tied specifically to a feminine notion of teaching and literature, which is rooted in feelings and emotions and how it makes you feel. And when you get to the male professors, they are often too focused on thinking and ideas and philosophy and these kind of things. And these kinds of ideas matter because, like me, there are numerous students that come into the classroom who have never met a professor before, who didn't know a professor when they were growing up. And I think that these really do matter in terms of how they create these expectations for professors. What is allowed, what should not be allowed, what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And I hope that things like The Chair would produce more accurate representations of this that are less rooted in those harmful stereotypes. Thank you.
All right, we'll give our speaker a short break. So if you haven't gotten a raffle ticket, let me know and I'll get one to you. All right, so we are giving away the Grit City Think and Drink hats, which again, as I am told by anybody younger than me, this is even cooler in the summertime if you wear it than if you wear it when it's cold. All right. Numbers. The other stereotype of professors is that they have to put on reading glasses to actually read anything. I don't know where that stereotype comes from. All right, our first hat goes to last three digits, 689. 689. Anybody? I was going to say nobody left, so I'm pretty sure. Hey! Nothing like putting a think and drink hat on a almost of age future student. All right. The second hat goes to last three digits, 683. 683. Dana. All right. So if you didn't win, definitely come back in April. Our speaker for April is here. So hopefully you'll come back to see Ilya. So thank you all for coming. Remember, if you need to get access to the to get your name on the listserv, just let me know. You can send me an email. I'm at jimgal@uw.edu. I think I forgot to introduce myself. I'm actually a professor across at UW Tacoma and been hosting. This is the 7th year of the Grit City Think and Drink, so we're pretty excited to keep going. So excellent. All right. So we have now it's time to play Stump the Speaker. So it's question and answer time. So feel free to ask the speaker our questions. All right. Come on up, Daniel.
Yeah. So the question was in early in the presentation, I referenced the way that female and non-binary professors are often treated in terms of harassment, in terms of student evaluations that are negative or critical of their appearance or the way they speak, in ways that often male or cisgender male professors are not. And so the question was, have I experienced that, or more to the point, not experience that? And I will say that I have heard many people tell me about how they get comments on student evaluations having to do with their clothing, the way they look, the way they speak, their accent, or whatever it might be, in ways that I have never, ever received any comments about. Most of the comments, whether negative or positive, that I receive on student evaluations are about the content of the course, about the assignments, nothing personal ever. I believe one time one student said something about the way I dressed, but that was once, and it was far outweighed. I don't remember. I don't know. Yeah. I think it was positive. I don't remember. Oh, it was my socks. Yeah, it was something about my socks. But I have heard stories from many professors who get those kind of critical comments about their appearance, their speaking voice, their persona in ways that I have never received. And I definitely attribute that to my gender. Like that is definitely the case there. Yeah. And I think if I'm and I don't mean to be too critical about the mirror has two faces, but and I think that question having to do with what is the sort of nature of the difference between a male professor represented in a film in which he is not engaging with the students, not interacting with the students, not sort of asked to do those things, not expected to do those things, which is the main point I was trying to make there. Whereas a female professor, that is expected and sort of needed for them to do their job. Yeah, and I would say that one of the problematic things in The Mirror Has Two Faces, in the chair even, which is, supposedly a more enlightened representation, often is that those things aren't questioned, that Jeff Bridges in The Mirror Has Two Faces wants to be a better teacher, but his job is not really on the line. He's not in danger. He didn't get really bad student evaluations that said this. He just wants to do that. Whereas I think when you're looking at the representations of the female professors or female presenting professors in these things, that often is presented as necessary for them to gain the students' trust or respect. And even when we go back to school, very, very horrible back to school, that is not enough there either. And that she's teaching to a large lecture hall. She's apparently a very popular professor on campus, and yet still the way she is treated by Rodney Dangerfield specifically in the film is a sexual object that is not the way in any way that he interacts with the male professors at all, or that any other character interacts with them. And I think that hopefully answer your question about at no point do they present the male professor being sort of disengaged with the students or cut off from the students as something they need to work on in order for their career or anything like that. It's never presented that way. It's sort of, it's fine that they're that way. And I think Jeff Bridges is the example of a professor who wants to do it better, but not he doesn't have to. In other words, his job is not on the line to do that. Yeah, he just wants to. Back to school specifically, and I think I can connect the 2 points, both those points you were making. In back to school specifically, her job becomes to help him. And she tutors him at night, and she goes above and beyond, sort of like there's a scene where she finds out I mentioned this, that he plagiarized an essay. It's the Kurt Vonnegut thing. And her reaction is not, now you fail or anything like that. It's like, well, now I need to help you more. and I'll do even more for you to help you out. And so in that movie where you take a professor and a student who end up having a relationship together, and you talk about power dynamics, and I think in that movie, how screwed up the representation is, even in that professor student relationship as it's depicted in the movie, the power dynamics are still with him. He's still in charge. She's helping him again and again throughout the movie, and focused only on him and no other student. So even there, her sort of like her authority in there is sort of disappearing. No other the two other male professors do not help him. By the way, it's only her. They don't go out of their way to help him do anything. It's just her. And so I think even there, you have the authority of the professor over the student sort of switched because she's female, and he has the authority over her really in the end. So. And to that point too, like you were saying about the mirror has two faces. He has a book out. He's publishing. They don't really reference her publishing or her career really at all. She's helping him do that. And same thing there. Yeah, they don't really spend any moments with her and her scholarship or her work or her anything. But he does. He gets those. That hopefully answered your question.
Sorry, we're gonna have to
Yeah.
stop it here, but I'm sure you can ask the questions, some more questions as we're breaking down. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for coming. If you wouldn't mind, whatever food and stuff, if you could put it, throw it away or put your glasses in that tub in the back, that would be wonderful. And we hope to see you in April.